Canadian shipyards built 107 of the corvettes that served in Canada's own navy, and every single one of them was slower on the surface than the submarines they were sent to destroy. This is the story of the Flower-class corvette, the whale-hunting design that became the backbone of the Battle of the Atlantic, and of the argument historians are still having about whether these ships actually won that battle at all. Start at the finish, because the ending explains the shape of everything that came before it. On the 24th of May, 1943, the commander of the German submarine fleet wrote a conclusion into his war diary that no German officer had committed to paper before. Wolf Pack operations against convoys in the North Atlantic were no longer possible, the boats were being pulled out, and the Battle of the Atlantic had been lost. That sentence described the theater where Canadian corvettes had been carrying the majority of the escort work for the better part of a year. A Royal Navy monthly anti-submarine report from January of 1943 recorded that Canadian escorts were absorbing the brunt of the U-boat offensive in the North Atlantic, facing roughly half of the German submarines then at sea. 4 months later, the German submarine arm quit that ocean entirely. The obvious conclusion is that the corvettes won it. The obvious conclusion is also, according to the historians who have spent their careers inside the archives, not quite right, and the reasons it is not quite right make for a better story than the legend does. 205 feet of hull. That was the Flower-class corvette, displacing somewhere around 925 long tons, driving a single propeller, carrying one 4-inch gun designed before the First World War, and managing a top speed of 16 knots. 16 knots mattered enormously, because a surfaced German Type 7 U-boat could make better than 17. The ship built to hunt submarines could not catch a submarine on the surface, which meant that a U-boat commander who spotted a corvette coming and had sea room could simply drive away from it. That is the central fact about these ships, and almost nobody says it out loud. The Royal Canadian Navy entered the Second World War with 11 ships and 1,819 officers and men. By 1945 it fielded somewhere between 373 and 434 fighting vessels, crewed by around 95,000 personnel. That expansion ran to roughly 30-fold, and it was built almost entirely out of small ships, the most important of which had been derived directly from a commercial vessel designed to kill whales. What follows covers where that design came from, how a country with almost no warship building industry produced 100-odd of them in inland shipyards on the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence, and what happened to the men who crewed them. It covers the equipment crisis of 1942 that nearly ended Canada's role in the mid-ocean escort war. It covers the 10 corvettes that never came home. And it finishes with the last one, still floating in Halifax, the only survivor of her class anywhere in the world. The design ancestor of the Flower-class corvette was a whale catcher called Southern Pride. Smith's Dock Company of South Bank-on-Tees, near Middlesbrough, built her. She displaced roughly 700 tons and could manage 16 knots, and her job involved chasing whales in the Southern Ocean, which required 3 things that turned out to be exactly the 3 things an Atlantic escort needs. She had to survive appalling weather. She had to turn quickly to follow a target moving below the surface. And she had to cost little enough to be built in numbers. Early in 1939, with war approaching, the Royal Navy confronted a problem that destroyers could not solve. Destroyers cost too much, took too long to build, and demanded specialized shipyards and turbine machinery. Britain needed escorts in quantity, and needed them from yards that had never assembled a warship in their lives, which is when Smith's Dock offered up the answer already sitting on its drawing boards. William Reed, chief designer at Smith's Dock, handled the conversion. Reed took the whale catcher hull and stretched it by roughly 30 feet to gain speed, and the reason he needed that speed tells you everything about the design brief he was working to. The lengthening was calculated against the estimated surface speed of a German submarine. Reed was explicitly trying to build a ship that could outrun a surfaced U-boat. He did not quite manage it. The finished Flower class made 16 knots, and the Type 7 made more. The official designation for the concept was never corvette. In the flat bureaucratic language of the Admiralty it appeared as patrol vessel, whaler type. Corvette arrived as a revival, since the Royal Navy had applied the term before 1877 to a class of sailing warship, and somebody pulled it out of retirement for these new ships. Credit for that revival generally goes to the British Prime Minister, and the historian Brian Lavery supports the attribution in his book Churchill's Navy, published in 2016. The specifications deserve stating precisely, because the numbers carry the story. Length overall ran to 205 feet, about 62.5 meters. Beam measured 33 feet, roughly 10 meters. Draft sat at 11.5 feet. Displacement came in around 925 long tons for the original design, rising to about 1,015 tons for the modified version. Speed reached 16 knots, with a range of approximately 3,500 nautical miles at 12 knots. The designed complement stood at around 85 men including 6 officers, though wartime crews routinely swelled to 90 and above as more equipment and more weapons were crammed aboard. Armament on the original Flower class amounted to a single 4-inch breech-loading Mark 9 gun, a weapon of First World War vintage, backed by 2 twin Vickers .5-inch machine guns and 2 twin .303 Lewis guns. 2 depth charge throwers and rails carried about 40 charges. Many Canadian units also shipped minesweeping gear at first, which later came out once it became clear that minesweeping was not what these ships would spend their war doing. The modified Flower class improved on all of it. Same 4-inch Mark 9, but with a 2-pounder pom-pom, 2 20mm Oerlikons, 4 throwers and rails for roughly 70 depth charges, and, most importantly, a Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar. 225 original Flowers were ordered under the 1939 and 1940 programs, with 69 of the modified type following from 1940 onward, giving a total of 294 by the count used in the standard reference literature. Other sources give 267, or around 263, depending on how cancellations and incomplete hulls get counted. That kind of disagreement recurs throughout this story, and it is worth getting used to early, because almost every headline number about the Corvette war depends on a definition somebody chose. The first order went in on the 25th of July, 1939, for 26 ships under the pre-war program, placed a little over 5 weeks before the war began. One technical decision inside the Flower class design explains why Canada could build these ships at all, and it has nothing to do with the hull. The answer sits in the engine room. A single 4-cylinder vertical triple expansion reciprocating steam engine drove the Flower class Corvette, producing around 2,750 indicated horsepower through one shaft, fed by 2 boilers, Scotch boilers at first and water tube boilers in later units. Triple expansion reciprocating machinery had aged badly by 1939. Warships used steam turbines, which delivered more speed, more power and better efficiency, and every serious navy in the world had already moved on. Turbines demanded specialist manufacturing capacity, specialist metallurgy, and specialist engineers to run them. Reciprocating engines demanded none of that. Reciprocating engines powered merchant ships, which meant commercial yards already knew how to build them, commercial machine shops already owned the tooling, and merchant seamen already understood how to operate them. There is a parallel here to a decision that large-scale computing made half a century later. When the big data centers were built out, the engineering choice was not a small number of exotic custom supercomputers, but enormous numbers of cheap standard commodity machines, individually unimpressive and collectively overwhelming, buildable by any supplier rather than one specialist vendor. The Flower class Corvette is the naval version of that reasoning. Do not build the best ship, build the ship that the entire industrial base can build simultaneously, and accept that each individual unit will be mediocre. That comparison is offered strictly as an analogy to illustrate the engineering logic, and not as a historical connection. That decision is why a country whose shipbuilding industry held almost no warship experience could put corvettes in the water inside a year. Canada in 1939 amounted to nothing as a naval power. 11 ships, and 1,819 officers and men. Some sources count 6 destroyers plus minesweepers and put the personnel figure nearer 3,500, with the variation depending on whether reservists are included, and either way the Royal Canadian Navy registered as a rounding error against the Royal Navy or the United States Navy. What Canada did possess was steel, shipyards accustomed to lake freighters and merchant hulls, and a machine tool industry capable of turning out reciprocating engines. During the spring of 1940, the Royal Navy transferred 10 corvettes to the Royal Canadian Navy. Canada's own program placed contracts for 64 corvettes under the 1939 and 1940 programs, with a further 43 built in the years that followed. Construction on the first Canadian-built corvette, His Majesty's Canadian ship Shawinigan, began on the 4th of June, 1940. By the end of that year, Canadian yards had turned out 20 corvettes. Read that again. A country with 11 warships and no warship building tradition laid down its first corvette in June and had 20 of them by December. Several of the shipyards that built Canada's corvettes were not on the ocean at all. Davy Shipbuilding at Lausanne, Quebec. Canadian Vickers in Montreal. Marine Industries Limited at Sorel. Collingwood Shipyards on Georgian Bay. Kingston Shipbuilding on Lake Ontario, and Port Arthur Shipbuilding at the head of Lake Superior. Midland and Morton Engineering. On the Pacific Coast, Burrard Dry Dock, Yarrows, North Vancouver Ship Repairs and Victoria Machinery Depot. On the Atlantic, the St. John Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company in New Brunswick. Look at that list geographically and the oddity jumps out immediately. Port Arthur sits roughly 2,000 miles from the open Atlantic by water, Collingwood lies on Georgian Bay, and Kingston occupies the eastern end of Lake Ontario. These were freshwater yards in towns whose shipbuilding experience consisted of lake freighters and ferries, and they were building ocean escorts for a submarine war being fought off Greenland. They managed it precisely because of the design choices already described. A corvette amounted, structurally, to a merchant ship with a gun on it. The hull followed merchant standards, the engine came from merchant practice, and the yards never needed to learn warship construction at all. They needed to learn how to build a slightly odd trawler in quantity, then send it down the St. Lawrence. The economics still look startling. According to Legion magazine, the early Canadian corvettes cost roughly $600,000 each on the west coast and about $530,000 elsewhere. His Majesty's Canadian ship Fredericton, built by Marine Industries at Sorel, was completed 5 months and 11 days after being laid down, at a cost of around $600,000 Canadian dollars. Early builds averaged closer to 10 months, and the yards accelerated as they learned. 5 months and 11 days, from bare slipway to commissioned warship. Then there is the naming, which is where the Canadian program diverged from the British one entirely. Royal Navy corvettes carried the names of flowers, which is where the class designation comes from. His Majesty's Ship Buttercup. His Majesty's Ship Orcus. The naval historian Ken McPherson made the dry observation that boasting about a U-boat sunk by a ship called Buttercup was a very British thing to do. Canada went the other way. Royal Canadian Navy corvettes took the names of Canadian towns and cities, an idea attributed to Admiral Percy Nels. Chambly, Moose Jaw, Shawinigan, Charlottetown, Weyburn, Alberni, Sackville, Regina, Louisbourg, and Trentonian for Trenton. Spikenard stands as the exception that proves the rule, a British-ordered hull that kept its flower name when it came to Canada. None of that naming was decoration, because it arrived attached to a civic sponsorship and adoption program. A town got a ship. The town's name reached the newspapers when the ship accomplished something. The town knitted for the crew, wrote to the crew, and raised money for the crew. And when the ship went down, the town found out. That connection is why the loss of a corvette in this war never registered in Canada as an abstract naval statistic. Each loss meant a specific place on the map receiving specific news. The corvette's reputation among the men who served in them is one of the few things in this story that no historian disputes. These ships were violently uncomfortable. The whole form came from a whale catcher, designed to be seaworthy rather than pleasant, and a corvette in an Atlantic gale did not cut through the sea so much as go over it, around it, and through it, rolling in a way that veterans described in language that has not aged. Seasickness never functioned as a phase that new crew members got over. It ran as a chronic condition of the ship. The interior stayed permanently wet, with condensation dripping from the deckheads onto men trying to sleep. In the original layout, the galley sat aft while the crew accommodation sat forward, which meant food had to be carried the full length of an open deck in whatever the North Atlantic happened to be doing at the time. Winter could freeze ammunition solid. Now consider who was living in there. The Royal Canadian Navy expanded roughly 30-fold, and Canada did not contain 30 times as many trained sailors. The overwhelming majority of the men who filled these ships belonged to the Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve, enlisted for hostilities only, trained fast, and sent to sea. The Department of National Defence's own account of His Majesty's Canadian ship Trentonian supplies the clearest single illustration. Out of a crew of 90-odd men, exactly one belonged to the regular force Royal Canadian Navy. Just one man out of 90, and most of the rest had never laid eyes on the ocean before they enlisted. That is the reality behind the phrase Canada's Corvette Navy. 90 men in a 205-foot steel box, one of whom was a professional sailor, in the worst ocean in the world, hunting professionals. James Lamb, who served in Canadian corvettes and later wrote The Corvette Navy, published in 1977, described the ships as small, battered, under-equipped and in need of repair, crewed by teenagers. Lamb's framing, that these amateurs took on and beat the German submarine professionals, is the romantic version of this story, and Lamb earned the right to write it. Lamb was a memoirist, though, and the point of this account is to separate what the veterans felt from what the records show. Hold that thought, because it matters enormously in about 20 minutes. One more separation needs making explicit, since it produces the single most common error in popular corvette history. Nicholas Montserrat's The Cruel Sea, published in 1951, remains the most famous book ever written about corvette warfare. Montserrat served in Royal Navy corvettes and drew the book from that experience, and the book is also a novel. It is fiction. Nothing in this account is sourced from it, and no claim about corvette operations here rests on it. Alan Easton's 50 North presents a different case, a Royal Canadian Navy memoir, usable as personal testimony and treated that way here. On the 20th of May, 1941, the Newfoundland Escort Force was created, and Canada's Corvette War properly began. Leonard Murray commanded that force, holding the rank of Commodore at the time and rising later to Rear Admiral, and he is the officer around whom the entire Canadian side of this story eventually turns. The force worked out of St. John's, Newfoundland, escorting convoys across the section of the Atlantic that the Royal Navy could not cover. The geography needs stating clearly. Convoys ran in numbered series, the HX and SC series eastbound from Halifax and Sydney, the ON and ONS series westbound. Canadian escorts covered three distinct commitments: the Mid-Ocean Escort Force on the long transatlantic run, the Western Local Escort Force covering the approaches to North America, and the Triangle Run, which shuttled between Halifax, New York and St. John's. The long haul from St. John's to Northern Ireland was known to the men who sailed it as the Newfie Derry Run. New ships worked up at Tobermory in Scotland, while bases at Halifax, Sydney, St. John's, Londonderry and Gaspé anchored the whole system. The first kill arrived in September of 1941, during one of the worst convoy battles of the year. Convoy SC-42 was under attack. Two Canadian corvettes, His Majesty's Canadian ship Chambly under Commander James Prentice and His Majesty's Canadian ship Moose Jaw under Lieutenant Frederick Grubb, had never been part of the escort at all. Murray later described the circumstances in plain terms, saying that two of his Newfoundland vessels had a week to spare and were, by good luck, in position to reinforce the escort group involved. On the 10th of September, 1941, Chambly and Moose Jaw sank U-501. What happened at the moment of the kill ranks among the strangest incidents of the Atlantic War. As Moose Jaw closed alongside the damaged submarine, the commanding officer of U-501 jumped from the U-boat's deck to the corvettes, a leap of roughly 9 feet, in what appears to have been an attempt to save himself. Moose Jaw then rammed the submarine. Chambly put a boarding party aboard U-501. Lieutenant Ted Simmons, who led it, received the Distinguished Service Cross, and Prentice received the Distinguished Service Order. The Royal Canadian Navy's single fatality in the action was Stoker William Brown of the Chambly boarding party, who drowned when U-501 went down beneath him. That was the whole cost in Canadian lives, because the first U-boat killed by the Royal Canadian Navy took one Stoker with it, and it happened because two corvettes had a spare week. A footnote belongs here that the tidy version of this story leaves out. U-501 was regarded as the Royal Canadian Navy's first submarine kill until the Admiralty later reassessed the records and credited His Majesty's Canadian ship Ottawa, working alongside His Majesty's ship Harvester, with the destruction of the Italian submarine Comandante Faa di Bruno on the 6th of November, 1940, nearly a year earlier. That reassessment, documented by Fraser McKee in the Northern Mariner, marks the first appearance of a process that eventually reshapes every number at the end of this story, with post-war committees going back through German and Italian records and moving credit around. 9 days after the U-501 kill, Canada lost its first corvette. On the 19th of September, 1941, His Majesty's Canadian ship Levis was torpedoed by U-74 south of Greenland. Before the crisis of 1942 arrived, 2 more corvettes were gone, and neither went down the way people expect warships to be lost. On the 7th of December, 1941, a date the rest of the world remembers for something else entirely. His Majesty's Canadian ship Windflower was lost in the North Atlantic in a collision with the merchant ship Zypenberg. Around 23 men died. No submarine took part, only fog, a convoy, and a merchant hull. On the 10th of February, 1942, His Majesty's Canadian ship Spikenard was torpedoed by U-136 near Iceland, and roughly 57 men were killed and 8 survived. Spikenard was the British-ordered hull loaned to the Royal Canadian Navy on the 15th of May, 1941, the corvette with the flower name in a Canadian fleet named after towns. 8 survivors out of a ship's company. That is the arithmetic of a torpedo hit on a 900-ton escort in the North Atlantic in February. Then, in May of 1942, the war came inside Canada. On the 12th of May, 1942, the steamship Nicoya was sunk in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and the Battle of the St. Lawrence began. German submarines were now working in Canadian home waters, inside the Gulf, within sight of Canadian shorelines. The consequences ran both military and political. On the 9th of September, 1942, the St. Lawrence was closed to transatlantic shipping, and 2 days later, on the 11th of September, His Majesty's Canadian ship Charlottetown was torpedoed by U-517 off Cap Chat in the St. Lawrence. 9 men were killed. A Canadian corvette, named for a Canadian provincial capital, destroyed by a German submarine inside the Gulf of St. Lawrence. In November of 1942, U-518 put a German agent ashore at New Carlisle, Quebec. Werner von Janowski was caught almost immediately. The espionage value came to nothing, and the symbolic value ran considerably higher, because German submarines were not only sinking ships in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, they were using it as a landing beach. The base at Gaspé, His Majesty's Canadian ship Fort Ramsey, existed because of this campaign. The Battle of the St. Lawrence ran from 1942 into 1944, and its peak fell in that summer and autumn of 42. Here is the strategic bind that campaign created. Every corvette pulled into the Gulf was a corvette absent from the mid-ocean run, which meant Canada was fighting 2 escort wars at once with a fleet built for one, and doing it with equipment that fell further behind the enemy every month. Which brings us to the part of this story that Canadian naval history has been arguing about ever since. Everything so far has been built up. This is the center of the whole account. By the autumn of 1942, the Royal Canadian Navy's corvette fleet was carrying an enormous share of the North Atlantic escort burden. The Royal Navy's own monthly anti-submarine report for January 1943 recorded it explicitly, noting that the Canadians had borne the brunt of the U-boat attack in the North Atlantic for the previous 6 months, facing roughly half of all German submarines then at sea. And during that same period, the Canadian escort groups were losing more merchant ships than the British groups were. That fact started the argument. The British explanation and the Canadian explanation had nothing in common, and modern historians have largely settled which one was right. The British position, put simply, held that this was a performance problem. Canadian escort groups performed less effectively, their crews had received less training, their group tactics ran weaker, and the results in the convoy columns proved it. The Canadian position held that this was an equipment problem, compounded by a deployment problem. Take the equipment case first, because it can be measured. The single most important piece of technology in the escort war by 1942 was radar, and specifically centimetric radar. The Royal Navy had the Type 271, which could detect a surfaced U-boat at around 3 miles, roughly 4.8 kilometers. More than that, it could pick up a periscope alone at 900 yards, about 820 meters. Type 271 first went aboard His Majesty's ship Orcus in March of 1941, and by October of 1941 around 30 sets were in operation. Canadian corvettes did not have it. They carried SW-1C and SW-2C, Canadian-designed metric wavelength radar sets, a generation behind, unable to resolve small targets against sea clutter. The difference between metric and centimetric radar comes down to resolution, and the modern equivalent people encounter every day is the gap between an early digital camera and a current one. Both produce an image, and only one produces an image detailed enough to identify what you are looking at. A metric wavelength set could tell a corvette that something was out there. A centimetric set could tell a corvette that the something was a periscope, at 900 yards, at night. That is not an incremental improvement, it is the difference between suspecting and knowing, and the comparison is offered only as an analogy to convey the technical gap. The radar gap was not the only one. Canadian corvettes lacked high-frequency direction finding, known as HUF-DUF, the shipborne equipment that let an escort take a bearing on a U-boat's radio transmissions. German submarines talked to each other into headquarters constantly, since wolf pack tactics required it, and an escort group with HUF-DUF could turn that chatter into a direction and run down the bearing. An escort group without it heard nothing at all. Canadian corvettes also frequently lacked gyrocompasses, which sounds like a minor fitting and is not. Without a gyrocompass, holding an accurate attacking course during an ASTIC approach, the sonar attack run on a submerged submarine becomes far harder. The corvette's ability to convert a contact into a kill was degraded at the most basic level of ship handling. And Canadian corvettes had no Hedgehog, the forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar that let an escort attack ahead of itself rather than passing over the target and dropping charges astern. No centimetric radar, no direction finding, often no gyrocompass, no Hedgehog, against a submarine force at the peak of its effectiveness. Now the second half of the Canadian argument, the deployment problem, and this is where it gets genuinely infuriating. Modernizing the corvette fleet meant a heavy refit, extending the FOCSLE for seaworthiness and habitability, fitting Type 271, fitting Hedgehog. Canada lacked the shipyard infrastructure to do that work at scale while simultaneously building new hulls, and the obvious answer was to send corvettes to American yards. The Canadian government refused to pay for it. The objection came down to a balance of payments concern about spending Canadian dollars in the United States. The consequence of that decision appears in Legion magazine's account, and it borders on unbelievable. A group of Royal Canadian Navy corvettes had been modernized at Charleston, South Carolina, in late 1941, and those were the best-equipped ships Canada owned. By the time the U-boats returned to the North Atlantic in force in the autumn of 1942, the exact moment those ships were needed, most of them were on loan to the United States Navy. Canada's best corvettes were somewhere else during Canada's worst convoy battles. The argument between the Royal Navy and the Royal Canadian Navy came to a head in December of 1942. On the 17th of December, 1942, the British Prime Minister formally requested that the Canadian escort groups, the Sea Groups, be withdrawn from the mid-ocean run. Canadian naval staff rejected the British reasoning outright, and their counter-argument came in three parts. First, the equipment case already set out. Second, that Canadian groups were being handed unreliable Royal Navy destroyers, which broke down and left the corvettes short. Third, that Canadian groups were disproportionately assigned the slow convoys, and a slow convoy spends longer in the danger zone, which mechanically produces higher losses no matter how good the escort is. They even had British support on the technical point. Lieutenant Commander P. M. Bliss, a Royal Navy officer stationed in Ottawa in late 1942, put it in writing, stating that bringing the C groups up to the technical standard of the B groups would produce a very great increase in efficiency without reference whatever to training and experience. Read that carefully, because it is a Royal Navy officer demolishing the Royal Navy's own argument. Bliss is saying the gap was never a matter of skill. The gap was equipment. Then, at exactly the wrong moment, came convoy ONS 154. ONS 154 sailed at the end of December 1942, escorted by Canadian Group C-1 under Lieutenant Commander G. S. Windier. Between the 26th and the 31st of December, the convoy was routed through the widest part of the mid-Atlantic air gap, struck by a hurricane, and attacked by roughly 20 U-boats. 13 to 14 merchant ships were lost. Whatever the merits of the Canadian technical case, ONS 154 destroyed the political argument. Early in 1943, the Sea Groups were transferred out of the mid-ocean run to United Kingdom and Gibraltar waters, to be re-equipped and retrained. The Canadian corvette fleet, the ships that had absorbed roughly half the German submarine effort for 6 months, was pulled off the main battlefield. The institutional consequences landed fast. Vice Admiral Percy Nels, Chief of the Naval Staff, was dismissed early in 1943, and the minister responsible for naval services had by then formed the view that corvettes were obsolete. Here is what makes this the contrarian core of the whole story. Modern historians, and Mark Milner is the central name, through North Atlantic Run and the U-boat hunters, alongside Roger Sardi, W. A. B. Douglas and Michael Whitby in the official operational history No Higher Purpose and a Blue Water Navy, have largely vindicated the Canadian position. The weight of the archival work indicates that equipment and deployment, not courage and not basic competence, drove the poor Canadian results of 1942. The men in those corvettes were not worse sailors. They were sent into the most contested waters of the war with obsolete radar, no direction-finding equipment, no ahead-throwing weapon, and often without a gyro compass, on the slow convoys, while the best-fitted Canadian ships sat on loan elsewhere. Modern engineering has a concept that describes this situation with uncomfortable precision, and it goes by the name of technical debt. An organization builds fast on an outdated platform because building fast is urgent, and every month it defers the upgrade, the gap widens, until the accumulated shortfall produces failures that get blamed on the operators rather than on the platform. The Royal Canadian Navy expanded 30-fold in 3 years on a technological base it never paused to modernize, and when the failures arrived, the first instinct was to fault the crews. That comparison is offered as an analogy to the management problem alone, and not as a historical claim. The cruelest part is the timing. Canadian groups came off the mid-ocean run early in 1943, and the decisive battles of the Atlantic were fought in the spring of 1943. As Britannica puts it, the Royal Canadian Navy was not a major element in those battles. Canada's corvette fleet sat in the repair yards during the victory it had spent a year making possible. Between the 1st and the 12th of March, 1943, the Atlantic Convoy Conference met in Washington, D.C. That conference redrew the command map of the Atlantic and produced the most important Canadian outcome of the naval war. On the 30th of April, 1943, the Canadian Northwest Atlantic Command was established, with Rear Admiral Leonard Murray as Commander-in-Chief. The appointment deserves a pause, because the claim attached to it is the kind of claim that usually falls apart under checking, and this one holds. Leonard Murray, born 1896 and died 1971, is the only Canadian to command an Allied theater of operations in the Second World War. Not the only Canadian to command Canadians. The only Canadian to command an Allied theater. Britannica, the Canadian Encyclopedia and Veterans Affairs Canada all state it. Murray had run the Newfoundland Escort Force since 1941, and from the 30th of April, 1943, the entire Northwest Atlantic became a Canadian command. March of 1943 also marked the climax of the Battle of the Atlantic, with the worst convoy losses of the war. And then the whole campaign broke open. Convoy ONS-5, running from the 28th of April to the 6th of May, 1943, is generally identified as the turning point. Within weeks the German submarine campaign in the North Atlantic collapsed. In the period the German Navy itself came to call Black May. On the 24th of May, 1943, the commander of the U-boat arm withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic. His own account of the decision, set down in his memoirs, gives the reasoning. Wolf Pack operations against convoys in the North Atlantic, the main theater and simultaneously the theater where Allied air cover ran strongest, were no longer possible. He withdrew the boats, and the Battle of the Atlantic had been lost. That quotation is widely reproduced online with the date given as the 24th of May, 1945, which is wrong. The correct date is 1943. The privately admitted framing that often accompanies it in popular histories is an author's gloss, not part of the original text. Now read what the German commander actually blamed, because it is the hinge of this entire account. He named Allied air cover as the cause. The title of this video is a claim, and the time has come to test it. The popular framing of the Battle of the Atlantic, the version repeated in books and films and documentaries for 80 years, holds that small, cheap, under-equipped escorts crewed by amateurs took on the German submarine service and beat it. James Lamb's phrase captures it: teenagers who took on and beat the U-boat professionals. The historians who have spent their careers in the archives do not say that. What Mark Milner, Roger Sardi, W. A. B. Douglas and Michael Whitby describe, and what the official operational history sets out, is a victory produced by a combination of factors that all matured at roughly the same moment in the spring of 1943. Very long-range Liberator aircraft, which closed the mid-Atlantic air gap, the stretch of ocean known as the Black Pit where no land-based aircraft could reach. Escort carriers, which brought air cover along with the convoy. High-frequency direction finding, which turned German radio discipline into a targeting solution. Signals intelligence, known as Ultra, which allowed convoys to be routed around wolf pack concentrations. Centimetric radar, the Type 271, which stripped the U-boat of its ability to attack on the surface at night. Support groups, independent hunting formations that could be detached to reinforce a convoy under attack rather than being tied to it. And Hedgehog, which turned a corvette's attack run into something other than a coin toss. At ONS-5 itself, the battle identified as the turning point, much of the actual killing was done by aircraft and by support group destroyers. The honest answer to the question in this video's title is that the corvettes did not beat the U-boats by themselves, and the historians who know the records best have never claimed they did. That answer is incomplete, though, in a way that is far more interesting than the myth. Every one of those war-winning technologies required something to be true first. Very long-range aircraft, escort carriers, direction finding, ultra-routing, centimetric radar, support groups and Hedgehog all functioned as force multipliers, and every one of them multiplied something. The something was the convoy escort system, the continuous, unglamorous, freezing, seasick business of putting warships around merchant ships every single time they crossed, for 6 years, without a gap. The Corvette is what made that continuity possible, because the Corvette was the only escort that could be built fast enough and cheaply enough to be everywhere at once. Here is the number that carries the argument. According to data compiled by Paul Heersink and reported by Canadian Geographic, 25,343 ship transits from North America were completed between 1939 and 1945, carrying nearly 165 million tons of supplies. The Canadian War Museum gives the same figures, over 25,000 merchant ships and nearly 165 million tons. 25,343 crossings. The corvettes did not win the Battle of the Atlantic. The corvettes are the reason there was still an Atlantic supply line left to win it with. That is a smaller claim than the legend and a much harder one to dismiss. While the mid-ocean argument was playing out, Canadian corvettes were dying somewhere most people never associate with the Royal Canadian Navy at all. On the 6th of February, 1943, His Majesty's Canadian ship Louisburg was sunk in the Mediterranean by an Italian aircraft-launched torpedo. Stop on that sentence, because almost every element of it contradicts the standard picture of the Corvette war. Not the North Atlantic. Not a U-boat. Not even a German aircraft. A Canadian corvette, named for a fortress town in Nova Scotia, sunk in the Mediterranean by an Italian torpedo bomber. 16 days later, on the 22nd of February, 1943, His Majesty's Canadian ship Weyburn was mined off Gibraltar, and 8 men were killed. 2 Canadian corvettes lost inside 3 weeks, both outside the North Atlantic, both to weapons that had nothing to do with submarines. This is what the withdrawal of the sea groups meant in practice. The Canadian escort groups pulled off the mid-ocean run early in 1943 were transferred to United Kingdom and Gibraltar waters, framed as re-equipment and retraining, which it was. The Gibraltar and Mediterranean routes were never a quiet corner, though, since Axis Air Power operated from land bases with the whole Mediterranean within range, and mines waited in the approaches. Louisburg and Weyburn are the corvettes lost during Canada's supposed rehabilitation period. There is a pattern in how these ships died that deserves naming explicitly, because it cuts against the imagery. 10 Royal Canadian Navy corvettes were lost. Out of those 10, only 6 went down to submarine torpedo in something resembling the classic convoy battle. Windflower was lost in a collision with a merchant ship, Louisburg was sunk by aircraft, and Weyburn was mined. Of the 6 torpedoed, 2 were lost in the English Channel and 1 inside the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The Corvette War, as it actually killed Canadians, amounted to less a duel with U-boats in the mid-ocean than a long exposure to every hazard the sea and the enemy could produce, across 4 theaters, for 5.5 years. The corvettes that emerged from the 1943 refits were, in practical terms, a different class of warship from the ones that went in. The modernization package addressed the specific deficiencies that had been argued over all through 1942. The extended FOCSLE, meaning the raised forward deck running further aft, transformed the ship's seaworthiness and habitability at a stroke, giving the crew a dry route between accommodation and the rest of the ship while reducing the amount of North Atlantic that came aboard in a gale. Type 271 centimetric radar replaced the SW-1C and SW-2C sets, and Hedgehog gave the Corvette a weapon it could throw ahead of itself. Consider what each of those changes did to the tactical problem. Before the refits, a corvette detected a surfaced submarine at whatever range the lookouts and a metric radar set could manage, which at night in a seaway might amount to no range at all. It closed at 16 knots, slower than the target. If the submarine dived, the corvette ran in on astic, frequently without a gyrocompass to hold the attacking course, passed over the contact and lost sonar contact in the final moments of the approach, then rolled depth charges off the stern into water where the submarine had been rather than where it was. After the refits, Type 271 could show a periscope at 900 yards, and hedgehog threw its charges forward, ahead of the ship, while astic contact was still held. The attack no longer required the escort to blind itself at the decisive moment. That is the difference between a ship that harasses submarines and a ship that kills them. The pre-hedgehog depth charge attack has a modern parallel in any system that has to act on information it stops receiving at the moment of action, the way an old autofocus camera would lock focus and then lose the subject in the instant the mirror flipped up and the shot was taken. You aimed at where the target had been, then fired blind and hoped it had not moved. Hedgehog is the equivalent of keeping the subject in view through the exposure, and that comparison is offered purely as an analogy for the sensor problem. This is where the equipment argument of 1942 receives its final piece of evidence. The same ships, with the same men, given better sensors and a better weapon, became far more effective. Nothing about Canadian seamanship changed between 1942 and 1944. The equipment changed, and nothing else did. The Corvette's late war career also went somewhere its designers never imagined. In 1944, Canadian corvettes supported the Normandy landings as part of Operation Neptune, the naval component of the invasion. A ship derived from a South Atlantic whale catcher, built in a freshwater yard on the Great Lakes, was escorting the largest amphibious operation in history. His Majesty's Canadian ship Albany shot down a Junkers 88 during Neptune. Hold that detail, because Albany comes back. For Royal Canadian Navy corvettes were lost in the final year of the war, and they were lost in waters that were supposed to be won. On the 8th of August, 1944, His Majesty's Canadian ship Regina was torpedoed by U-667 in the English Channel. 13 days later, on the 21st of August, 1944, His Majesty's Canadian ship Albany was torpedoed by U-480, also in the English Channel, and around 59 men were killed. The ship that had shot down a German bomber over the invasion beaches was gone in the same summer. The English Channel in August of 1944 counted, on any strategic reading, as Allied water. The invasion had succeeded, the Atlantic campaign had been decided 15 months earlier, and German submarines killed 2 Canadian corvettes there in a fortnight. Then the war came home one more time. On the 25th of November, 1944, His Majesty's Canadian ship Shawinigan was torpedoed by U-1228 in the Cabot Strait, the passage between Cape Breton and Newfoundland that opens into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Shawinigan was lost with all hands, around 91 men. Remember where this story began its Canadian chapter. Construction on the first Canadian-built corvette started on the 4th of June, 1940, and that ship was Shawinigan. The first corvette Canada ever built for itself was sunk with her entire crew, in Canadian home waters, 5.5 months before the war in Europe ended. The last was His Majesty's Canadian ship Trenton Ian, torpedoed by U-1004 in the English Channel on the 22nd of February, 1945, and 6 men were killed. Trenton Ian was the final Royal Canadian Navy corvette lost in action in the Second World War, and Trenton Ian is the ship whose crew composition the Department of National Defence recorded, more than 90 men aboard, of whom 1 belonged to the regular force Royal Canadian Navy. That is the bookend for the whole corvette program. The first Canadian-built corvette and the last Canadian corvette lost, both crewed overwhelmingly by men who had been civilians a few years earlier, both sunk by submarines at moments when the campaign was supposed to be over. This next part exists because the corvette story gets told routinely with ships in it that were never corvettes, and the errors run so common that correcting them counts as new information for most people. His Majesty's Canadian ship Esquimalt was sunk off Halifax on the 16th of April, 1945, torpedoed by U-190, and she was the last Royal Canadian Navy warship lost in the war and one of the most frequently cited losses in Canadian naval history. Esquimalt was not a corvette. She was a Bangor-class minesweeper. His Majesty's Canadian ships Clayoquot, Ketabucto, and Guysborough were also Bangor-class minesweepers rather than corvettes. His Majesty's Canadian ship Raccoon was an armed yacht. His Majesty's Canadian ship Valleyfield, lost on the 7th of May, 1944, was a river-class frigate. His Majesty's Canadian ship Ottawa, lost on the 13th of September 1942, was a destroyer, the same Ottawa that shares credit for the Commandante Faad Bruno. St. Croix, Skeena, Athabascan, Fraser, and Marguerite were all destroyers as well. This matters beyond pedantry, because the ship type determines what the loss actually tells you. A Bangor minesweeper torpedoed in the approaches to Halifax in April 1945 is evidence about inshore submarine operations in the last weeks of the war, and it is not evidence about mid-ocean convoy escort. A destroyer lost means the loss of a fast, well-equipped, well-manned unit. A corvette lost means the loss of a slow, underarmed unit crewed almost entirely by reservists. Blending them together produces a story that is emotionally coherent and analytically useless. 10 corvettes, not 11 and not 15. The figure of 11 appears in some sources, and the discrepancy generally traces to loaned hulls being counted differently, or to minesweepers and armed yachts being folded into the corvette total. The count is 10. Levis, Windflower, Spikenard, Charlottetown, Louisburg, Weyburn, Regina, Albany, Shawinigan, and Trentinian. Every popular account of the Royal Canadian Navy in the Second World War carries a set of headline statistics, and almost all of them are disputed. What follows takes them one at a time and shows the disagreement rather than hiding it, because the disagreements reveal more than the numbers do. Start with how many corvettes there actually were. The Naval Marine Archive and other construction records put the number of Flower-class hulls built in Canadian yards at roughly 121 to 123. The number that served in the Royal Canadian Navy is 123, made up of 111 Flower-class plus 12 of the larger Castle-class. That figure appears directly in the United States Naval Institute's Naval History magazine of December 1999, and it matches Legion magazine's summary of the standard reference work, McPherson and Milner's Corvettes of the Royal Canadian Navy, 1939 to 1945. Of the 111 Flowers, 107 were built in Canadian yards, with the remainder British ordered or loaned hulls. Other sources say 109 were commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy. The numbers differ because the questions differ. Built in Canada is not the same as served with Canada, Flower class is not the same as corvette, and commissioned is not the same as in service. 8 Canadian-built modified Flowers went to the United States Navy under reverse Lend-Lease, out of a Royal Navy order for 15, which means a ship could be Canadian-built, British-ordered, and American-manned, and get counted 3 different ways by 3 different authorities, all of them correct. Now the U-boats. The Canadian War Museum states that the Royal Canadian Navy sank, or shared in the destruction of, 31 enemy submarines. Britannica states that Canadian warships, alone or alongside other ships and aircraft, sank 33 submarines, plus 42 enemy surface vessels. Wikipedia's Royal Canadian Navy article and Military History Now both give 33 as confirmed, and 3 Italian submarines get counted separately in some tallies. 31 or 33. The gap is not sloppiness, it is the residue of 2 things, whether shared and assisted kills are credited to Canada, and the post-war reassessments carried out by the U-Boat Assessment Committee, which went through captured German records and moved credit around. Fraser McKee documented several of those reassessments in the Northern Mariner, with U-163 reattributed to His Majesty's Canadian ship Prescott, and the Commandante Faad Bruno reattributed to Ottawa and Harvester. For the corvettes specifically, Legion magazine reports that 20 corvettes earned solo or shared credit in 17 of the Royal Canadian Navy's 33 U-boat kills. Across all navies, the Flower class is credited with sinking or participating in the destruction of 47 German and 4 Italian submarines, with 36 Flowers sunk during the war, 10 of them Canadian. Now the losses. Britannica records that the Royal Canadian Navy lost 31 ships and suffered 1,990 fatalities. The Canadian Encyclopedia records that the Royal Canadian Navy lost 33 ships and suffered 1,990 fatalities. Those 2 entries share a casualty figure and disagree on the ship count. Canada's government sources cite 2,000 Royal Canadian Navy dead, While Wikipedia's Royal Canadian Navy article gives 1,797 sailors. The range on Canadian naval dead in the Second World War runs from 1,797 to 2,000, depending on which authority you consult and how each defines a naval death. And the merchant seamen. Canada's government sources cite 1,600 Canadian merchant seamen killed. Wikipedia gives 1,500, including 8 women. The Juno Beach Center gives 1,451 lost on Canadian-flagged ships, a figure that runs lower precisely because it is tied to a flag rather than a nationality. 59 Canadian-registered merchant ships were sunk by enemy action. The Canadian Merchant Navy suffered the highest casualty rate of Canada's 4 services. Not the highest number, the highest rate. The men who were not in the escorts, the men in the ships being escorted, died in a greater proportion than the sailors, the soldiers, or the airmen. That fact should reframe the entire Corvette story. Corvette crews were cold, seasick, under-equipped and frightened, and the men they were protecting were dying faster. Finally, the claim that will not die. Somewhere in almost every discussion of Canada's wartime navy, somebody states that Canada finished the Second World War with the 3rd largest navy in the world. The Canadian War Museum does say 3rd largest, after the United States and Britain. Britannica says that at the end of the war the Royal Canadian Navy ranked as the 4th largest fleet in the world, behind the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, with more than 400 warships. The answer lands on 3rd or 4th, depending entirely on whether the Soviet Union enters the comparison. The ranking itself is the wrong argument, though, and Britannica supplies the correction in the same breath. The Royal Canadian Navy had no battleships. It had no fleet carriers. It had no submarines of its own. Canada did not build the 3rd or 4th most powerful navy in the world. Canada built the 3rd or 4th most numerous fleet of small escorts and auxiliaries in the world, which is a completely different achievement, and arguably a more interesting one. Counting hulls turns Canada into a great naval power. Counting capability leaves Canada as exactly what it was, the country that produced, out of nothing, the largest specialized convoy escort force it could manage, because that was the job in front of it. The honest version of the claim runs like this. By 1945 the Royal Canadian Navy had grown from 11 ships and 1,819 personnel to somewhere between 373 and 434 fighting vessels, around 471 including auxiliaries, crewed by roughly 95 to 96,000 personnel, including some 6,000 to 6,500 women of the Women's Royal Canadian Naval Service. That is a 30-fold expansion in under 6 years, achieved by a country that had spent the 1930s deciding it did not need a navy. The ranking is a distraction, and the expansion is the story. To understand why an underarmed, slow, uncomfortable ship mattered so much, you have to understand what a convoy is, because the convoy ranks among the least intuitive ideas in military history. The instinct, when ships are being sunk, is to disperse them. Spread out, present smaller individual targets, avoid putting all the cargo in one place. That instinct is wrong, and the Atlantic proved it. Gathering merchant ships into a single large formation with a ring of escorts accomplishes several things at once. It concentrates the defense, so a handful of escorts protects dozens of ships rather than one each. It reduces the number of targets a submarine can find, because 40 ships traveling together occupy roughly the same searchable area of ocean as one ship traveling alone, which means a submarine patrolling a stretch of sea encounters a convoy or encounters nothing, rather than meeting a steady trickle of individual vessels. And it converts the problem from protecting every ship everywhere into protecting one moving formation. The mathematical principle underneath the convoy system matches the principle underneath insurance and underneath modern network traffic shaping, where pooling risk across a group produces a better aggregate outcome than leaving each unit to face the risk alone, even though concentrating feels more dangerous. An individual merchant captain in a convoy sat inside a formation that attracted wolf packs, which is why the system felt insane to the men inside it. The aggregate loss rate nevertheless came in lower than dispersal produced. That is stated strictly as an analogy for the statistical logic, and not as a historical connection. That system is what the Corvette existed to make possible, and it explains why the Corvette's shortcomings mattered less than they should have. The Corvette could not catch a surfaced U-boat, and it never had to. It had to be present, in numbers, permanently, forcing the submarine to attack a defended formation instead of hunting freely. 25,343 crossings, carrying 165 million tons. The people inside that formation, the ones the corvettes were there for, deserve their own moment. Rear Admiral Leonard Murray, who commanded the Newfoundland escort force and later the Canadian Northwest Atlantic, left a description of the merchant captains he dealt with in the winter of 1942 into 1943, quoted in Robert Halford's The Unknown Navy. Murray's assessment held that up to a quarter of those captains would probably not reach the United Kingdom in their own ships, and that about half of that number would not reach the United Kingdom at all. Murray's next observation carries the weight, because he added that there was never a waver in their resolve. Those men were civilians, undecorated, unconscripted, untrained for combat, and they went back across. One more quotation belongs in every account of this campaign, and it requires care. The British Prime Minister wrote, in his history of the war, that the only thing that ever really frightened him during the conflict was the U-boat peril, and that he felt more anxious about the Atlantic battle than about the air fighting over Britain in 1940. That is the substance of the passage. The exact wording varies between editions, since both ever frightened me and ever really frightened me circulate, and the line most often reaches people secondhand through John Terrain's Business in Great Waters, published in 1989. The passage is authentic, and the variants are not. What matters here is the content of the admission. The head of the British government, looking back at bombing, invasion threat, and 6 years of land campaigns, identified the Atlantic Supply War as the thing that frightened him. That was the war the corvettes were in. The corvette occupies a place in Canadian memory out of all proportion to its combat record, and it is worth being honest about how that happened, because the process ran partly deliberate. In 1943, Hollywood made a film called Corvette K225. The production used a real Royal Canadian Navy corvette, His Majesty's Canadian Ship Kitchener, standing in for a fictional ship called His Majesty's Canadian Ship Donnacona, and Halifax appeared on screen disguised as Hannington Harbour. A wartime feature film, made while the campaign was still being fought, using real Canadian ships and a real Canadian port under a false name. That is not a documentary. That is a country's naval war being packaged as narrative in real time, for an audience that included the families of the men aboard. Add the naming policy, which carried every corvette's Canadian town into the newspapers. Add the civic adoption program, which handed each town a direct emotional stake. Add the fact that a corvette's crew came overwhelmingly from volunteers who had been civilians, which made the corvette navy, demographically, the general public in uniform. By 1945 the corvette had stopped being merely a warship type in Canada. It had become a national self-image, small and improvised and underestimated and effective anyway. Here is an episode that shows exactly where legend and record diverge, and it comes from the most celebrated corvette of them all. Sackville's wartime crew attacked U-boats twice in heavy fog, and on both occasions the ship's company believed the submarines had been destroyed. That is what the men aboard understood to have happened, and that is what they carried home. After the war, German records were checked. The boat had survived, and it returned to France for repair. Nobody lied, and nobody exaggerated on purpose. In fog, aboard a 900-ton escort, with the sensors of 1942, an attack that produced debris and noise and no further contact looked exactly like a kill. The crew's account was honest and wrong. Multiply that by every escort in the Atlantic, over 6 years, and you have the reason the U-boat Assessment Committee existed at all, and the reason the totals still move. 31 or 33 is not a bookkeeping quarrel, it is the residue of thousands of men trying to work out, from sound and oil slicks and wreckage in the dark, whether they had just killed something. The corvette legend rests on genuine courage and genuinely uncertain evidence, in roughly equal parts. Both halves are true, and an account that reports only the courage is not honoring these men, it is flattening them. Go back to the specification sheet one more time, because reading it as a list of features misses what it actually is. Read as a set of trade-offs, the Flower-class corvette becomes one of the most ruthlessly coherent designs of the war. Start with range, approximately 3,500 nautical miles at 12 knots. That figure defines the ship's entire strategic role, because 3,500 miles at 12 knots is enough to cross from Newfoundland to Northern Ireland with margin for zigzagging, for running down contacts, for weather. It is not enough to do anything else. The corvette could not patrol, could not hunt independently, and could not project force. It could accompany a convoy across a specific ocean and then stop. That is why the escort organization looked the way it did. The Newfoundland Escort Force, the Mid-Ocean Escort Force, the Western Local Escort Force and the Triangle Run existed as separate commitments because the ships doing the work carried fuel enough for one leg and not for the whole journey. The convoy got handed off, Halifax to St. John's to Londonderry, and back again on the Newfie-Derry run. Now speed, 16 knots against a Type 7 17+ on the surface. William Reed stretched the whale catcher hull by 30 feet specifically to close that gap, and the gap never closed. The tactical consequence is what makes the Corvette war so relentless. A destroyer that detects a surfaced U-boat can chase it down, and a Corvette cannot. The Corvette's only real advantage was its ability to force the submarine under, because a submerged Type 7 moved slowly, and once the submarine went down it could not keep up with the convoy, and the convoy escaped. That was the Corvette's actual combat function, and it almost never gets described accurately. The Corvette's job was never primarily to kill. Its job was to make the enemy submerge, and by doing so, to make the enemy lose contact. Judged as a submarine-killing machine, the Corvette rates as a poor weapon. Judged as a submarine-suppressing machine, it comes close to ideal, cheap and numerous and sufficient for the task, because outrunning a U-boat was never required. Being present in numbers was the requirement. Now the armament, read in that light. A single 4-inch breech-loading Mark 9 gun, a First World War design, backed by two twin Vickers .5-inch machine guns and two twin .303 Lewis guns for air defense, which ran thin even by 1940 standards, plus two depth charge throwers and rails carrying around 40 charges. None of that armament impresses on paper. The 4-inch gun existed mostly to engage a surfaced submarine, which is a target that submerges the moment it gets fired at, and that returns us to the suppression function. The gun's value was never accuracy. Its value was making the surface unsurvivable. The minesweeping gear that many Canadian corvettes initially carried is the tell for how uncertain the design brief ran at the outset, because nobody was entirely sure what these ships would be doing. The gear later came out, and that moment marks when the Corvette stopped being a general-purpose small warship and became a dedicated convoy escort. The modified Flower class then shows what happened once the requirement was understood. 69 of them were ordered from 1940 onward. Displacement rose to about 1,015 long tons. The 4-inch Mark 9 stayed, while the light machine guns gave way to a 2-pounder pom-pom and two 20mm Oerlikons, a serious anti-aircraft fit rather than a gesture. Depth charge capacity climbed from around 40 to roughly 70, with 4 throwers instead of 2, and Hedgehog joined the outfit. Compare the two lists side by side and the entire evolution of the escort war shows up in the changes. More depth charges, because attacks now ran as sustained sequences rather than single passes. Real anti-aircraft guns, because escorts were operating within reach of land-based aircraft in the Mediterranean and the Channel. Hedgehog, because attacking astern of a lost contact had proven to be a poor way to kill anything. The progression from original to modified is a textbook example of what modern product engineering calls iterating against real-world telemetry rather than against the original specification. The first flowers were designed against an assumption about what the war would be, and the modified flowers were designed against what escorts had actually encountered. The gap between the two lists records everything the Admiralty learned the hard way between 1939 and 1941. That is offered as a design process analogy only. Past the modified flower came the Castle class, the larger and more capable successor. 12 Castles served in the Royal Canadian Navy alongside the 111 flowers, making up the 123 corvettes in Canadian service. One last piece of the industrial picture shows how tangled the Allied production system had become. 8 Canadian-built modified flowers went to the United States Navy under reverse Lend-Lease, out of a Royal Navy order for 15. Canadian-built, British-ordered, American-manned. A hull designed by a British whale catcher yard, laid down in a Canadian town on a freshwater lake, ordered by the Royal Navy and crewed by the United States Navy. That single sentence contains the Battle of the Atlantic's logistics in miniature, and it is also, incidentally, why no two sources agree on how many corvettes there were. 294 Flower-class corvettes were built. 36 were sunk during the war. The rest were sold, scrapped, converted into whale catchers and merchant vessels, or simply left to rust away in the peace that followed. One of them survives. His Majesty's Canadian ship Sackville, pennant number K181, is the last Flower-class corvette in the world. Not merely the last one in Canada, but the last one anywhere on Earth. Sackville was built at the St. John Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company in New Brunswick. She was laid down on the 28th of May, 1940, launched on the 15th of May, 1941, commissioned on the 30th of December, 1941, and decommissioned on the 8th of April, 1946. Look at that first date. Laid down on the 28th of May, 1940, which is 24 days before construction began on the first Canadian-built corvette at all. Sackville is not a late warship or a museum reconstruction. She belongs to the very first wave of the Canadian corvette program, launched while the outcome of the Atlantic campaign remained entirely unknown. She is also the ship whose crew twice believed they had killed a U-boat in fog. What saved Sackville from the breakers was, of all things, science. After the war she escaped disposal and served as an oceanographic research vessel until 1982, which comes to 36 years of peacetime work, longer than her war service by a factor of 9. In 1983 she was transferred to the Canadian Naval Memorial Trust. The trust restored her to her 1944 configuration, extended FOCSLE, modernized layout, the ship as she stood after the refits that ended the equipment argument. That was a deliberate choice, because Sackville is preserved not as the ship Canada started the war with, but as the ship Canada finished it with. In June of 1988, the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada designated her a National Historic Site. She lies in Halifax, at Sackville Landing on the waterfront and at Her Majesty's Canadian Dockyard, serving as Canada's Naval Memorial, the national memorial to the Canadians who served and died at sea in the Second World War. And on the 15th of May, 2026, something happened to Sackville that has no real precedent. She was recommissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy. The recommissioning is symbolic and ceremonial rather than operational, since nobody intends to send a 1941 whale catcher derivative back to sea, and it was organized on the Halifax waterfront by the Canadian Naval Memorial Trust and the Royal Canadian Navy to mark the anniversary of her launch. She was launched on the 15th of May, 1941. She was recommissioned on the 15th of May, 2026. 85 years to the day. The Trust, chaired by retired Lieutenant Commander Greg Cottingham, has spent 4 decades keeping a 1940s steel hull afloat in salt water. That is a maintenance problem with no endpoint and no possibility of victory, only continuation, which is, in its way, a fair description of the escort war itself. The wider commemoration around her runs deep. Battle of the Atlantic Sunday falls on the first Sunday in May. A storyboard stands at Navy Plaza. There is a bust of Rear Admiral Leonard Murray. In Edmonton, a Corvette Street was dedicated on the 25th of August, 2010, which means a landlocked prairie city named a street after a class of ocean escort, and that tells you how deep this particular ship went into Canadian identity. The physical evidence, though, comes down to one hull. Out of 294 built, one remains. Bring the argument back to where it started. The Flower-class corvette was a whale catcher with a First World War gun on the bow. It ran slower than the submarine it hunted. It was so uncomfortable that seasickness functioned as a permanent condition rather than an adjustment period. For the most dangerous 18 months of the campaign, the Canadian ones lacked centimetric radar, direction-finding equipment, ahead-throwing weapons and frequently a gyro compass. They were crewed by men who, in at least one documented case, included exactly one professional sailor in 90. By every measure a naval architect or a staff officer would apply, the corvette was a bad warship. It was also, in combination with the convoy system, one of the most consequential vessels of the 20th century, and the reason has nothing to do with martial qualities. The reason is industrial. The corvette's decisive quality was that anyone could build it, anywhere, immediately. 64 ordered under the first Canadian program, 43 more after that. 20 in the water by the end of 1940. 107 Canadian-built Flowers in Canadian service. $530,000 to $600,000 apiece. 5 months and 11 days from keel to commissioning at Sorel. Built in Collingwood, in Kingston, in Port Arthur, towns whose previous maritime experience amounted to lake freighters. Very long-range aircraft won battles. Ultra saved convoys. Type 271 and Hedgehog killed submarines. Support groups broke wolf packs. None of those existed in sufficient quantity in 1941, though, and the ocean still had to be crossed in 1941. The Corvette held the line during the years when the war-winning technologies were still being invented, still being manufactured, still being argued over in committees. It bought time, at a cost of 10 Canadian ships and a share of somewhere between 1,797 and 2,000 Canadian naval dead. That is a more modest claim than the tiny ships that beat the U-boats. It is also the claim the historians will actually defend, and it diminishes nobody. The men in those ships were never told they were buying time. They were told to take a 900-ton escort into the North Atlantic in winter with equipment a year out of date and bring the convoy through. Most of them did it, 25,343 times. The dispute of 1942 never ended in 1942. It became the central question of Canadian naval historiography, and it stayed alive because both sides left evidence. The British had the results, since Canadian escort groups lost more merchant ships. That is not an interpretation, it is a count, and it formed the basis of the request of the 17th of December, 1942, and of the transfer of the sea groups out of the mid-ocean run early in 1943. The Canadians had the equipment schedules, which listed SW-1C and SW-2C metric radar set against the Royal Navy's Type 271 centimetric, no high-frequency direction finding, frequently no gyrocompass, and no Hedgehog. The best modernized Canadian corvettes, the Charleston refits of late 1941, on loan to the United States Navy at the exact moment the German submarines returned in force in the autumn of 1942. Royal Navy destroyers attached to Canadian groups breaking down. Canadian groups disproportionately assigned to slow convoys, which spend longer exposed. And they had Lieutenant Commander Bliss, a Royal Navy officer in Ottawa, writing that closing the technical gap between the C groups and the B groups would produce a very great increase in efficiency with no reference whatever to training or experience. The historians who went into the archives after the war built the modern picture out of both sets of evidence. Mark Milner is the name that recurs, through North Atlantic Run and the U-boat hunters. Roger Sardi, W.A.B. Douglas and Michael Whitby produced the official operational history of the Royal Canadian Navy, No Higher Purpose and a Blue Water Navy. David Zimmerman wrote The Great Naval Battle of Ottawa, which examines the administrative and technical failures at Naval Service Headquarters itself rather than at sea. James Lamb wrote the Veterans Account, in the Corvette Navy and on the Triangle Run. Fraser McKee worked the kill credit reassessments in the Northern Mariner. The weight of that work lands on the equipment side, and not because Canadian historians are defending Canada. The documentary record shows a fleet that expanded 30-fold in 3 years without a corresponding investment in sensors, weapons, refit capacity, or shore infrastructure, and then had its results attributed to the character of its crews. Zimmerman's contribution matters particularly, because his target is not the Royal Navy. His target is Ottawa. The failures he documents are Canadian administrative failures. The decision not to spend Canadian dollars on American refits was a Canadian decision. The prioritization of new construction over modernization was a Canadian decision. Vice Admiral Percy Nels was chief of the naval staff throughout, and he was dismissed early in 1943. The mature version of the contrarian argument, then, is not that the British were unfair to Canada. It is something harder. The British diagnosis was wrong about the cause and right about the symptom. The Canadian defense was right about the cause and could not survive ONS 154. And the deepest fault lay in Ottawa, where a navy had been allowed to grow enormous in hulls and shallow in the technical depth required to make those hulls dangerous. Any organization that has scaled its headcount far faster than it scaled its tooling and its training pipeline will recognize the shape of this. The output looks impressive on a chart and performs badly under load, and the first explanation offered is always that the newer people are not as good as the old ones. The measurable variable is almost never the people. That is offered as an organizational analogy only. Two more things follow that the popular story never mentions. The first is that the withdrawal worked. The C groups were re-equipped and retrained, modernization reached the fleet through 1944, and the corvettes that came back were far more capable ships. The humiliation of early 1943 produced the escort force of 1944. The second is the timing, and it is the bitterest fact in Canadian naval history. Canadian groups came off the mid-ocean run early in 1943. Convoy ONS-5 was fought from the 28th of April to the 6th of May, 1943. The German submarines withdrew from the North Atlantic on the 24th of May, 1943. Britannica's assessment holds that the Royal Canadian Navy was not a major element in the decisive battles. Canada spent 1942 absorbing roughly half the German submarine effort with obsolete equipment, and sat in the workshops when the battle turned. This story has a habit of dissolving into tonnage figures and kill credits, so here are the people in it. William Reed, chief designer at Smith's Dock Company, who took a whale catcher called Southern Pride and stretched her hull by 30 feet against the estimated surface speed of a German submarine. Reed's calculation fell slightly short, and the ships he drew still escorted 25,343 crossings. Admiral Percy Nels, chief of the naval staff, credited with the decision to name Canadian corvettes after Canadian towns, and dismissed early in 1943 when the equipment crisis broke. Commander James Prentice, known as Chummy, who commanded Chambly at Convoy SC-42 and received the Distinguished Service Order. Lieutenant Frederick Grubb, known as Freddie, commanding Moose Jaw on the 10th of September, 1941, the officer whose ship a U-boat captain jumped onto, and which then rammed the submarine. Lieutenant Ted Simmons, who led the boarding party onto U-501 from Chambly and received the Distinguished Service Cross. Stoker William Brown, of the Chambly boarding party, who drowned when U-501 sank. The Royal Canadian Navy's only fatality in its first submarine kill. Lieutenant Commander G.S. Windier, commanding the C-1 escort group at Convoy ONS-154 over the 26th to the 31st of December, 1942, facing a hurricane, the widest part of the air gap, roughly 20 submarines, 13 to 14 merchant ships lost, and a convoy battle that settled a political argument. Lieutenant Commander J.H. Stubbs, of C-1 on the westbound on convoys. Lieutenant Commander P.M. Bliss, Royal Navy, in Ottawa in late 1942, who put in writing that the Canadian problem ran technical rather than human. Rear Admiral Leonard Murray, 1896 to 1971, commander of the Newfoundland Escort Force from the 20th of May, 1941, Commander-in-Chief, Canadian Northwest Atlantic, from the 30th of April, 1943, the only Canadian to command an Allied theater of operations in the Second World War. The officer who recorded that a quarter of the merchant captains he sent east would not arrive in their own ships, that half of those would not arrive at all, and that not one of them wavered. Ken McPherson, the naval historian and co-author of the Standard Corvette Reference, who noticed the peculiar Britishness of celebrating a submarine sunk by a ship named Buttercup. Werner von Janowski, landed from U-518 at New Carlisle, Quebec, in November of 1942, and arrested almost immediately, the German intelligence service's contribution to the Gulf of St. Lawrence campaign. Greg Cottingham, retired lieutenant commander, chair of the Canadian Naval Memorial Trust, responsible for a 1941 hull that has now stayed afloat for 85 years. And roughly 90 men aboard Trenton Ian, of whom precisely one was a professional sailor. 10 Royal Canadian Navy corvettes were lost in the Second World War. Every one of them carried the name of a Canadian place, and every one of those places found out. His Majesty's Canadian ship Levis, torpedoed by U-74 south of Greenland on the 19th of September, 1941. The first Canadian corvette lost, 9 days after Chambly and Moose Jaw killed U-501. Canada's first submarine kill and Canada's first corvette loss fell inside a single fortnight. His Majesty's Canadian ship Windflower, lost in collision with the merchant ship Zypenberg in the North Atlantic on the 7th of December, 1941, taking around 23 men. No enemy involved at all, only a convoy, poor visibility, and 2 hulls in the same water. His Majesty's Canadian ship Spikenard, torpedoed by U-136 near Iceland on the 10th of February, 1942, with roughly 57 men killed and 8 survivors. The British ordered hull loan to Canada on the 15th of May, 1941, and the 1 corvette in Canadian service that kept a flower name. His Majesty's Canadian ship Charlottetown, torpedoed by U-517 off Cap Chat on the 11th of September, 1942, killing 9 men. Sunk in the St. Lawrence, 2 days after the river was closed to transatlantic shipping, a Canadian warship destroyed in Canadian inland waters. His Majesty's Canadian ship Louisburg, sunk by an Italian aircraft torpedo in the Mediterranean on the 6th of February, 1943. His Majesty's Canadian ship Weyburn, mined off Gibraltar on the 22nd of February, 1943, killing 8 men, 16 days after Louisburg. His Majesty's Canadian ship Regina, torpedoed by U-667 in the English Channel on the 8th of August, 1944, 2 months after the Normandy landings, in water the Allies had supposedly taken. His Majesty's Canadian ship Alberni, torpedoed by U-480 in the English Channel on the 21st of August, 1944, killing around 59 men. The corvette that had shot down a Junkers 88 during Operation Neptune, lost 13 days after Regina. His Majesty's Canadian ship Shawinigan, torpedoed by U-1228 in the Cabot Strait on the 25th of November, 1944, lost with all hands, around 91 men. The first corvette Canada ever built for itself, laid down on the 4th of June, 1940, sunk at the entrance to the Gulf of St. Lawrence with nobody left to describe it. His Majesty's Canadian ship Trentinian, torpedoed by U-1004 in the English Channel on the 22nd of February, 1945, killing 6 men. The last Royal Canadian Navy corvette lost in action, and of her ship's company of more than 90, 1 belonged to the regular force. Levis, Windflower, Spikenard, Charlottetown, Louisburg, Weyburn, Regina, Alberni, Shawinigan, and Trentinian. 10 towns, 10 ships, and 10 sets of telegrams. Return to the number this account opened with. 107 Canadian-built Flower-class corvettes served in the Royal Canadian Navy, out of 123 corvettes in Canadian service overall, out of 294 Flowers built worldwide. Every one of them was a whale catcher with a gun. Every one of them ran slower on the surface than the enemy it was built to hunt. And they escorted 25,343 crossings carrying nearly 165 million tons of the material that kept Britain in the war. The title of this video says that Canada's tiny ships beat the U-boats. The research says something more careful. The corvettes did not beat the U-boats on their own, because very long-range aircraft, escort carriers, high-frequency direction finding, signals intelligence, Type 271 centimetric radar, support groups, and Hedgehog all arrived together in the spring of 1943, and the German commander who withdrew his submarines on the 24th of May, 1943, named air cover as the reason. The corvettes are why there was a convoy system for those technologies to multiply. They are why the Atlantic supply line still existed in 1943 to be defended. And they were doing that work through 1942 with obsolete radar, no direction-finding gear, no ahead-throwing weapon and often no gyro compass, while being told the problem was their crews. 294 of them were built, and 1 is left. She lies tied up in Halifax. Launched on the 15th of May, 1941, and recommissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy on the 15th of May, 2026, 85 years to the day. Her crew once attacked a U-boat twice in fog and came home certain they had sunk it, and they were wrong, and they had no way of knowing. Sackville is Canada's naval memorial, and she is the only Flower-class corvette left anywhere in the world. The Royal Canadian Navy entered the Second World War with 11 ships and 1,819 officers and men, and came out of it with somewhere over 400 vessels, roughly 95,000 personnel, and between 1,797 and 2,000 of its own dead. It managed that with ships a naval architect would have called inadequate, crewed by men who were not sailors, built in towns that had never seen the ocean. So the corvette leaves a harder question behind than the legend does. By every technical measure that navies use, the corvette was too slow, too lightly armed, too badly equipped and too uncomfortable to be sustainable, and it was nevertheless the vessel that made the Atlantic supply line survivable long enough for everything else to arrive. Which means the standards that navies use to judge a warship do not describe the thing that actually mattered, and the men who took those ships to sea understood that before anyone in Ottawa or London did.